With Capcom as busy as they are, and likely a lot of predetermined content of Resident Evil 4 Remake's DLC, Resident Evil 9, and a remake successor to rear at some point assuredly first, does that leave room for remakes of other entries as well? Say Resident Evil 1 in the current engine, or dare I say, a bundle that includes Resident Evil 0 along with it. Is 0 even worth a remake to begin with? Wishful thinking? Perhaps. There's no denying the love and adoration Resident Evil 1 has for a variety of differing reasons. I know the purists will protest as the perfect remake of 1 already exists, and I'm not going to disagree with you. But it's not mutually exclusive that a newer iteration and a different gameplay style can't also coexist along with it. It doesn't diminish the previous iterations, it simply allows for a different demographic who don't share the same affinity for that specific iteration, and allows others to enjoy the same story. You got your cake, now others want theirs too. A way to make Resident Evil 0 more relevant, not just in potentially improving story elements and gameplay, would be to combine them as a bundle, with Resident Evil 1 leading in the spotlight and Resident Evil 0 as a bonus addition. Resident Evil 1 is probably the only Resident Evil game that could be remade several times over, and it wouldn't overly upset gamers by doing so. Granted, there's a small crowd that wouldn't mind Resident Evil 2 remade in a traditional sense, and Resident Evil 3's remake was lackluster, but redoing either of those again is a waste of time when other games have yet to even receive their first remake. Resident Evil 0 is a game many look at as an experiment. Not of the viral kind, but of the dual character system involving swapping in real time between the two main characters, Rebecca and Billy. You could say it was a prototype for Resident Evil 5's system, and a bit of a learning curve and learning lesson for Capcom. Even ignoring the experimental system though, does Resident Evil 0 hold up well enough on its own beyond that dynamic? Is there enough substance to warrant a remake of 0? On its own, it comes off as a side story, making a side character a main one, and adds what you could deem as unnecessary prequel info and lore before Resident Evil 1 takes place. Sure, it's nice to have, absolutely, and it provides a bit more insight into behind-the-scenes operations amongst Wesker, William Birkin from Resident Evil 2, how gross leeches can be, and we do get to see what kind of person Rebecca is as well. Does this just add to it being a somewhat forgettable experience? It's playing so much off of Resident Evil 1 that it doesn't focus enough on itself. If it were a bit retooled and got the reimagining treatment that current remakes have received, there's only one direction for it to go. Even if everything story-wise was kept the exact same, fixing the character system and potentially separating Billy and Rebecca for, say, a divided experience more like the original Resident Evil or Resident Evil 2 and its remake would greatly improve an okay product. If we dive a bit deeper into the lore and all facets of Resident Evil 0, beyond just an overall gameplay and surface level take on the game, it does have an advantage. Having direct connections to the game that started it all. It uses familiar and long-time adored enemy types while providing new and interesting enemies as well. Leeches are an on and off staple that are used throughout later entries in the series, even if not directly linked to Resident Evil 0's progenitor, precursor offshoot T-Virus. T-Virus being a combination of progenitor and leech DNA. This game also mentions in-progress creation of the G-Virus that will appear in Resident Evil 2.
I need a little more time to complete the more powerful G-Virus.
Being partially based off of Lisa Trevor's DNA in Resident Evil 1. The game's story and lore tries to enhance the original Resident Evil 1 while trying to balance expanded interest in new characters, and providing more insight into Rebecca and Wesker, whom continue their events in Resident Evil 1 as well. The first game, in all iterations, leaves these two characters at a bare minimum for who they are and what they're like, being present for a small volume of the game, especially since Resident Evil 1 doesn't have many cutscenes compared to other entries in the series. Resident Evil 0 expands on both quite a good amount, and since Rebecca's use more or less ends between the two games, it's basically how you get to know who she is beyond her minimal presence in the sequel in Resident Evil 1. Or no presence at all if you select Jill's campaign in that game. The thing that makes Resident Evil 0 a bit less unique is that beyond the beginning train section of the game, it feels way too similar to Resident Evil 1 in level design. After the beginning section, you arrive at a training facility. The facility, although not identical to the Spencer Mansion in Resident Evil 1, has serious vibes in the same vein. Now, partly to blame is the engine and assets being near the same or nearly so as Resident Evil 1 Remake. Maybe it was also intentional that because it is indeed a prequel, that aligning the two to be similar in appearances and locations makes more sense in that regard. I think this actually backfires a bit, as it doesn't separate quite enough from just being alongside DLC to Resident Evil 1 Remake instead of truly its own thing. Think how different Resident Evil 1 and 2 are from one another. Maybe that's just opinion, but the fact that a training facility, lab basement, factory, and a treatment plant are all recycled locations for basically every Resident Evil ever. It's a recipe for bland. Minus the train, I just described half of the original Resident Evil 3. If it came out bland, well, it's because it used bland ingredients to begin with. The train section is likely what you remember the most, because it's the most unique part of the game. Why Remaking 0 could greatly benefit it if there was enough audience that cared to see it. Spoiler, I don't think there is, but it's fun to think what if. To circle back here, what does bundling Resident Evil 0 with 1 provide? For cost, it allows Capcom to release a fully priced bundle. Separately, Resident Evil 0 and 1 are too short on their own to get a full price tag without coming off as leechy. See Resident Evil 3 Remake's blunder of overvalued cost at release being a full price game. Remaking 2 games at once is the tricky part here. Not that that's an issue in itself, but the time required to do both would likely push a potential release pretty far into the future. Even though they would share a lot of assets in creation, especially with crossover characters and enemies, it seems natural to do both at the same time, or near one another if Capcom were to do so. Is it necessary though? Would most gamers be more than happy if just Resident Evil 1 got attention once again? I think that's the unfortunate truth, and sales figures for Resident Evil 0 aren't by any means through the roof impressive compared to most other entries in the series, likely killing any chance before it got a start. But hey, you never know. Resident Evil 0 was originally planned and created long before it actually arrived. Planned as a Nintendo 64 release. Maybe Capcom values it in a different light than most. Does an improved and updated Resident Evil 0 interest you, or would you rather have a Resident Evil 1 without 0 attached? Let me know down in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time on Hittobox.